I want to really talk to you about what food sort of means to you. So were you a really keen baker before you started this? And, I think for a lot of us, food is a way that we express our culture. It's a way that we celebrate our culture because it's, one of the most accessible, one of the most fun ways to do that. So what does baking and food mean to you?
Well, right now it means that I'm hungry and I want to eat.
Yes, that too.
Yeah. So I feel, so to start off, I think I was 4 years old when I first got exposed to baking with my grandma who baked my cake, like I mentioned earlier, for my 5th birthday. And I like to tell people that I started baking at 4, but I didn't. Cracking some eggs, dropping them, and mixing them doesn't mean that I'm baking, right?
For sure.
My real baking started when I moved from New York to the Seattle, Washington area, where I finally had a home that had a kitchen where I did not have to store pots and pans in my oven. So now I could finally bake and learn how to bake. So I didn't bake until I was in my 30s in 2017. Started with, I didn't bake cookies until 2020. And then I didn't bake bread until like maybe 2019, 2020 as well, right?
Wow.
It's only been a few years that I've been baking, right?
Yeah.
Which gives me a lot of imposter syndrome, because like I'm not classically trained. I don't have a cordon bleu background, So I feel like, ooh, how can someone like me run this group? How can someone like me write a whole cookbook? But here I am, you just work hard, you keep experimenting, you keep innovating, you keep baking, you keep at it, And food really is a cornerstone of culture, just like language, right? Like you said, it brings us together, it connects us, it reminds us of our past, and then, all the things that we love to eat as a child, we could bring back. And then that's why I let my son eat tongyun during, Lunar New Year. And then we have mooncakes during Mid-Autumn Festival. I don't want that to be lost. I want that. I want him to know all of that. I want him to have dim sum. I want him to eat food from a wok. I want my mom to keep cooking for us so that we don't lose that part of our identities. I think food and baking is just so important. And Sharon, some people might say like Asian baking is not a thing, but you know what? It really is a thing. Google it right now. You'll see that it's a growing world. It's a growing culinary innovation. It's as much of a baking thing as French baking, American baking, Italian baking, and British baking. So
100%.
All very important, all very, very, very special to me.
100%. And I definitely agree with you that, food is a way that we connect with our culture, and how you're trying to pass that on to your son is something that is really admirable, because I think, this podcast is for Asians in the West. It's for Asians who grew up in Western countries. And I think we all have a similarity, or I think most of us have a similarity, where growing up, you're surrounded by Western kids and you really want to fit in. This is not new news. A lot of us feel this. It's really an immigrant story, right? So you go through primary school, you go through high school, you want to eat what the white kids eat. You want to speak like how they speak. So I think for me personally, and a lot of people in our audience, growing up, you sort of not shun, but you try and suppress that Asian side of yourself. I remember, going to the Asian bakery, picking up like a pineapple bun and feeling really embarrassed to eat that in school because everyone else was having, ham sandwiches, or there's a bakery in Australia called Baker's Delight, which is like a very Australian bakery, and they have, ham and cheese croissants, they have like sourdough loaves, and I was there with like a pineapple bun or like those paper wrapped sponge cakes, and it was very, very different. Now that we're, all in our 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever, we're all adults, and we're all really itching to connect back with that mother culture, because maybe a lot of us sort of pushed that away when we were young, and we're kind of making up for lost time. I feel like I'm personally making up for lost time. So, with Lunar New Year, eating those foods is really important. Like you and your son, the mooncakes, the tangyuan, even if that might not be to your taste buds, but symbolically it means something. Absolutely. So I love that.
Thank you. And I also feel like we need to take back our story and our narrative too. So I was just Googling Asian baking today, And I was very happy to see like our feeds, like Subtle Asian Baking and my website Modern Asian Baking, were top of the list, right? So if right now if you Google Asian baking, you'll see most of the stuff is from my group and from me, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, you see very top searches are from feeds that are not Asian run. And I feel like, it's not that we don't want like non-Asians to bake the Asian way or non-Asians to not be the experts, but maybe we want more stories from our AAPI content creators because we have those nostalgic stories that we can tell, right? We have these techniques that were passed down from our grandma who learned in the kitchens of Hanoi, Vietnam, right? Which were also
100%.
French inspired. So there's all these like stories that we can tell, right? Which brings me to a point where, sometimes people would say, you shouldn't tell people that you're an Asian woman baker, right? But maybe I should tell people that because my story is all about Asian baking, right?
Yes.
So it has an authentic spin to it, right?
Yeah.
So we have to recapture, our stories and our narratives and, be more vocal about telling them.
100%. It's like you've got a point of difference and you want to be able to communicate that and have other people who identify with that be a big part of it. And I think, there's a big similarity between the sort of subtle Asian baking, your sort of intentions behind it, as well as this podcast. Like you said, it's not just for Asians, but it is a space where Asians can feel seen and feel heard and feel like they belong to something. And going back to that point where you said, a lot of the people who post, they have their own personal stories behind their recipes. And I've really seen this, scrolling through the group, someone might post a recipe on, say, a matcha brownie, and they'll have a beautiful story about, their background in baking, how they used to bake with their grandma, or if someone posts a traditional recipe, something about, this being a big part of their childhood. So what I really love about this community is that it's not just recipes, it's not just, this is a cake, this is the ingredients, this is the method. It's very personal to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I really felt that I resonated with a lot of the stories because, you have those Asian family values in there. Grandma passing it down to mum, mum passing it down to you, or even grandma straight to you. And it's very like warm and fuzzy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like sharing these stories doesn't mean that we're, not embracing our American side or our Western side as well. It's just another part of us that we want to share, right?
100%.
It doesn't erase our American identity, right?
100%.
I love mooncakes as much as I love a turkey on Thanksgiving. I celebrate Lunar New Year as much as I celebrate New Year's Eve with a glass of champagne. And Halloween I love, It's just another part of us, but it doesn't make us any less American or any less Western. And we're not trying to say that it's better. It's not. It's just another story that we want to tell. And so that, when someone features something on Lunar New Year or they do like, a bake-off that's Asian related and things like that it's done a little bit more respectfully. Right? That you're telling the stories that should be told, right?
100%.
I feel like a lot of people get a little offended when we embrace our Asian side, especially as Asian women. But at the same time, why are we being erased? Why do we have to shut off our identities and who we are, right?
100%.
Like I said, I'm as proud of being an Asian American woman as much as I am proud of being an American woman.
100%. And I think that's the beauty of being, cross-cultural and having an ethnicity that is your mother country, but also being part of, for example, for you, America, and for me, Australia. That's the beauty of the whole immigrant story because you're part of both cultures. And you celebrate the great things in both cultures. And you're right, just because you're a part of this group or just because you listen to this podcast, it doesn't mean that you're shunning your, Western side. There's so many different facets of every person. And I think for Asians living in the West, you've got both sides, considering the political landscape, considering the social landscape. It's really, really important to be to tell the stories that we perhaps haven't been able to. Perhaps our parents haven't been able to, because when they grew up in Western countries, so when they grew up in America or Australia, perhaps society wasn't as open. So I think what you're doing is really beautiful. And anyone who is not a part of the group, what are you doing? Hop on there.